Good evening. I'm Bonnie Bouchard with the League of Women Voters of the Lower Cape Fear. Welcome to you all, UNCW students and faculty, and the League of Women Voters of the Lower Cape Fear, the OLLI community, members of other organizations, and the wide community of the Lower Cape Fear who have joined us this evening, and especially our distinguished speakers, Professors James Leloudis and Robert Korstad. 101 years ago, in February of 1920, the National American Woman Suffrage Association transitioned into the League of Women Voters. Although the 19th Amendment had not yet been proclaimed, the suffragists knew it would happen that year, and they wanted to prepare women to vote. And from our suffragist days to this very moment, the League has worked to reform our voting laws and to make voting as accessible as possible to all Americans. We want to grow voting and participation in our democracy. We fight gerrymandering and we fight voter suppression. Now our nation has been newly awakened to the fact that democracy is fragile. The League would like to thank UNCW for hosting this event and thank our League President, Marla Barthen, Zach Lemons, Coordinator of Leadership Development and Community Engagement, and Dr. Aaron King from UNCW for their hard work for putting this together. And also our student interns for their hours stuffing gift bags for the students, all in preparation for this discussion. Now I'd like to introduce Dr. Aaron King, Associate Professor in the Department of Public and International Affairs at UNCW, who will introduce our speakers. Dr. King.
Bonnie muted me without me knowing it. So, well, thank you all. And thank you for being here. Just to extend again another thank you to Marla, Bonnie, the League of Women Voters of the Lower Cape Fear, as well as our special guest this evening. As she said, we're grateful to the Osher Lifelong Learning Center, the Office of Student Leadership and Engagement, and several other academic departments for their support. As a scholar of American politics myself, the issues that the authors will speak about tonight are salient today, just as they've been in the past, particularly in the light of the declining trust in political and social institutions, among other evidence of the erosion of our democracy, which includes the storming of the US Capitol earlier this year. Unfortunately, we don't need to look far from UNCW, nor too far in the past to see other reasons for concern. Fortunately, we're in an excellent position tonight to learn from the past to help us understand the present, thanks to our special guest tonight. So very excited to introduce Dr. James L. Leloudis, Professor of History and the Peter T. Grauer Associate Dean for Honors Carolina and Director of the James M. Johnston Center for Undergraduate Excellence at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. He is also the co-chair of the UNC Commission on History, Race, and a Way Forward. Dr. Robert R. Korstad is Professor Emeritus of Public Policy and History at Duke University's Terry Sanford School of Public Policy. I received my PhD at Duke and had several classes both in Sanford as well as over in Chapel Hill. So it's my pleasure to welcome these accomplished scholars from these great institutions that were also very influential in shaping my own academic life. So thank you all for spending some time with us, and I'll turn the floor over to our distinguished speakers tonight. Thank you.
Professor King, thanks for that introduction. And we want to thank the League of Women Voters and our colleagues at UNCW for this opportunity. We really feel privileged to have the chance to spend some time with you tonight and to talk about our book and the history and the current state of North Carolina's fragile democracy. We're also very grateful to our dear long-term friend Bonnie Bouchard, who set this motion in progress. So thanks all around for that. If you'll bear with us, we're going to switch to a PowerPoint deck here to share with you some photographs, images from this remarkable story. I think you'll find the images very engaging in a way they tell the story almost all by themselves. You might want to increase your Zoom screen to full screen so that you're able to hopefully read some of the text that'll be on the images. But if it's not legible, don't worry. You won't miss anything that we don't otherwise cover. We originally put together this presentation with the expectation that we would be projecting it onto a large screen. So bear with me just a second. We'll see if the technology gods are with us this evening. There we go. It looks like they are. Well, this book, Fragile Democracy, grew out of work that Bob and I have done as expert witnesses for the plaintiffs in a series of voting rights lawsuits, beginning with House Bill 589 back in 2013, and most recently, litigation focused on Senate Bill 284, the law that would implement the new voter photo ID requirement in North Carolina elections. Those laws have raised very fundamental questions about our democracy. And so we wrote this book hoping to share our research and share our discoveries with as broad a general audience of readers as possible. Now, two themes run throughout Fragile Democracy. The first is to note that North Carolina has a long and cyclical history of voter suppression through measures that on their face appear to be race neutral, but when implemented have had a profound discriminatory effect on minority voters, particularly Black voters. The second idea that runs through this book, and will run through the talk tonight, is that the struggle for voting rights has also been a struggle for economic rights. And as we'll illustrate this evening, when race has been used as an instrument of exclusion from political life, the result has been a society in which vast numbers of citizens, Black and white alike, have been denied the elements of meaningful freedom, a living wage and access to quality education, health care, and housing. Now, the story we tell in Fragile Democracy begins with the death of racial slavery at the end of the Civil War and the subsequent formation of a remarkable biracial alliance of former slaves and white allies within North Carolina's newly established Republican Party. In 1868, that alliance rewrote the state constitution, replacing a government once dominated by slaveholders with a democracy instituted, the new Constitution said, solely for the good of the whole. A democracy founded on the principle, again in the words of the Constitution, that all citizens have a right to enjoy the fruits of their own labor. And that, of course, was an elemental concern for Black North Carolinians whose toil, until very recently, had enriched the white men who enslaved them. This new state constitution also guaranteed free elections. It granted all adult men the right to vote. It mandated the establishment of a system of public education. I often in class ask my students to raise their hands if they were educated in North Carolina, in the public schools, and remind them that they owe that privilege to these democratic aspirations of people newly freed from bondage. Now, no sooner than they were committed to paper, these expansive notions of democracy came under assault by self-styled conservatives. They called themselves that with a capital C. They were men who decried what they called Negro domination. They hid beneath Klansmen's hoods, and they waged a campaign, a war really, of terror and political assassination against Black citizens and their white allies. And these terror tactics quickly produced the desired results. In 1870, conservatives triumphed over what they dismissed as the unwise doctrine of universal equality. And they subsequently impeached Republican Governor William Holden, removed him from office, and then passed laws that granted Klansmen amnesty for criminal acts, including murder, that were committed in the name of white supremacy. But this conservative victory was not complete. Black men could still vote, and during the 1870s and 1880s, they and like-minded whites continued to elect black officials at the local level and also in the state legislature. This is a really quite remarkable photograph of the North Carolina House of Representatives in the mid-1870s. And if you look closely, you can see the African American members of that body over on the lower left, and also, I'm afraid, obscured by the text, but on the the lower right and the upper left as well. Well, those small victories, as you might imagine, were unsettling for conservative whites who saw in them the threat of a fresh challenge organized across the race line. And that fear became reality in the mid-1890s when hardships caused by a sharp downturn in the national economy motivated a sizable minority of white farmers and laborers to bolt the Democratic Party, the party of the conservatives, and to join a third-party populist movement, and then to forge what they called a fusion alliance with black and white Republicans. That alliance won control of state government in 1894 and 1896 and established what historians have described as the late 19th century South's most democratic political system, most democratic state government. Fusion lawmakers rewrote state election law with what sound like strikingly modern reforms. The revised law, for example, required campaign finance reporting, mandated that employers give workers time off on election day to cast their ballots, and protected voters from harassment and obstruction at the polls. Those fusion lawmakers also equalized per capita spending for black and white schools. They shifted the weight of taxation, the burden of taxation, from individuals to corporations, and made very generous appropriations to state charitable and correctional.
I'm sorry, Jim, you'll have to unmute yourself again.
Where did you lose me?
Correctional.
Oh, okay, great. I'm not quite sure what happened there. Thanks for that. Well, in the wake of these fusion reforms, as has been the case in the late 1860s, the response from white conservatives, who now call themselves Democrats, was violent and swift.
It's not letting me move.
Okay, we've got a problem on this end as well. I'm going to stop the screen share and start again. Okay, there we go. I think as any of us have used this technology for the last year and a half in the classroom know, it works beautifully when you practice it, and it never works when you're live. But here goes. Let's see, for the third time, as looking, kind of making the comparison back to what happened immediately after the Civil War, the response to this kind of democratic expansion, democratic with a little d, was violent and it was swift. And I think especially folks in Wilmington, you're very familiar with this story. In 1898 and 1900, conservatives, now calling themselves Democrats, organized white supremacy campaigns to end what they called Negro rule. Here's a very powerful and deeply disturbing political ad from the News and Observer at the time. Those Democrats also organized squads of vigilantes who called themselves red shirts to intimidate voters on election day. This photograph is of a group of red shirts in Laurinburg, and if you look closely, the man 1, 2, 3, 4 from the right, you'll see that he's brandishing a pistol. And of course, in Wilmington, the violence was at its worst, where vigilantes rose up in a riot and removed a biracial city government in the only municipal coup d'etat in American history. And again, for folks in Wilmington, this image may be familiar, but we thought it worth putting on the screen tonight, even so. Just to kind of ask us all to ponder for a moment this image. When you look closely and realize what it is, it's a souvenir postcard produced, in this case, showing the burned out husk of Liberty and Charity Hall, the home of Wilmington's black newspaper. If you can imagine buying up a couple of dozen of these things in 1898, right, to share with your friends so that they would know that you had been present at this dramatic event. Well, in 1900, having restored themselves to power, conservative Democrats moved to consolidate their victory. They established a new Jim Crow regime by passing laws that required racial segregation in public places, and by amending the state constitution to strip black men of the right to vote by means of a literacy test. Now, the literacy test is a kind of perfect example of something I referred to at the beginning, and that is an instrument of voter suppression that on its face is race neutral, and yet in its implementation had a profound discriminatory effect. Here's the language of the constitutional amendment that imposed a literacy test. So if you wanted to register to vote, you had to pass this test. And I try to help my students understand it this way. You can see the requirement seems very simple. Every person presenting himself for registration shall be able to read and write any section of the Constitution in the English language. The issue here, of course, is there's broad discretionary room for registrars to decide who will have to take the test, how the test will be constituted, and what it is required to pass it. So I asked my students to do this, and let me ask everybody on the screen to do the same tonight. This is an educated, civically engaged group of folks to take out a piece of paper and write out for me Article 3 of the U.S. Constitution. And I usually ask for a show of hands of people who even know what Article 3 is about. And maybe out of a class of 120, I get a dozen hands who know that that article established the federal judiciary. Right? So you can see here the power of what appears to be a race-neutral test to enforce vast discrimination, particularly on African American voters.
So most Americans, certainly most white Americans, think of Jim Crow simply as an expression of prejudice and discrimination. But it was much more than that. Jim Crow was a system of power and plunder that concentrated wealth in the hands of a small minority and mobilized racial animosity in defense of that accumulation. Segregation trapped most blacks on the land as a semi-bound workforce and held their earnings to near subsistence levels. That had the effect of dragging down white wages by devaluing labor in general, a result that poor whites were not inclined to challenge lest they be impoverished further by the loss of this minimal racial privilege. This regime immiserated black people and vast numbers of whites as well. Now, historians often describe the first half of the 20th century as the nadir of American race relations, the most repressive era since slavery, when equal citizenship seemed utterly unobtainable. It's all remarkable then that in black communities across North Carolina, black civic leaders like educator Charlotte Hawkins Brown and newspaper editor Lewis Austin, seen here, orchestrated voter registration drives that, despite the literacy test, managed by the end of the 1930s to add tens of thousands of black voters to registration rolls. Most of these men and women who are voting now registered as Democrats, surprisingly. They sought to challenge Jim Crow from within the political party that held power in the South. Now, these developments, along with growing black political influence within the National Democratic Party, were causes for grave concerns among white conservatives. So much so that North Carolina Senator Josiah Bailey warned in the mid-1930s that white Southerners might be left with no choice but to form what, quote, a new white man's party in the South. That warning, as it turned out, was remarkably prescient. Now, World War II escalated the threat to white rule. Millions of blacks left the South for jobs in the northern defense industries, as they had done during World War I. The ranks of the NAACP swelled from 50,000 to nearly 500,000 members over the course of the war. And black activists across the country rallied for a double victory against fascism abroad and Jim Crow at home. Here in North Carolina, black workers successfully unionized R.J. Reynolds tobacco factories and stimmeries in Winston-Salem. And in 1947, they backed the election of Reverend Kenneth Williams to the Winston-Salem Board of Education. He was the first African-American candidate to win a municipal election in North Carolina, and probably in the South since the time of the Wilmington coup. Now, black tobacco workers were in the vanguard of a statewide campaign for more inclusive politics. In 1948, they provided local support for the Progressive Party, formed by breakaway liberal Democrats to support the 1948 candidacy of Henry A. Wallace. In North Carolina, the party nominated a slate of candidates that represented an extraordinary commitment to equal citizenship. Of the 19 candidates on the state ticket, 7 were black and 5 were white women, including journalist Mary Watkins Price, the first woman to ever run for governor in the state. Wallace was a full-throated critic of Jim Crow. Echoing fusion lawmakers from the late 19th century, he argued that racial subjugation drove a wedge between black and white working people and impoverished them both. The Progressive Party's defeat in North Carolina was a foregone conclusion, but in the debate that followed, the decade that followed, rather, the blacks continued to make incremental gains, particularly in local elections in eastern North Carolina, where much of the state's black population was concentrated. G.K. Butterfield was elected to Wilson Town Council in 1953, and here he is taking the oath of office.
The response from state lawmakers was, again, predictable. They were unwilling to tolerate even the smallest black advances. And so they moved to block the election of black local officials by reorganizing municipal and county governments, particularly in the East, where much of the state's black population was concentrated. And what they did in these locales is they went in and they got rid of ward systems of political representation and replaced them with at-large systems of representation and at-large multi-member elections. So think about how this works mathematically. We've all participated in these kinds of elections. You go into the voting booth and say there are 3 seats open on the county commission. The ballot says, of these 5 candidates on the ballot, choose your favorite 3. Now, mathematically, that is all but certain to disadvantage any electoral minority. Again, think about the situation. You go into the voting booth, you vote for the candidate who you favor most strongly, but you also have to vote for 2 others. A black voter might cast a ballot for the black candidate, but then has to cast ballots as well for 2 white candidates. Now, the only way to overcome that disadvantage was to engage in what was called single shot or bullet voting. And that was for black voters to go into the polling place, and when the ballot said choose 3 out of 5, they would choose only 1 and not cast the other 2 votes. Well, again, lawmakers were quick to respond to that. As soon as black voters began to engage in single shot voting, they outlawed the practice, arguing that it was a violation of little d democratic principles. And so you can, again, see the regional concentration here of anti-single shot provisions.
All of these measures slowed, but could not stop a burgeoning civil rights movement. And the story should be familiar to all of us. In February of 1960, 4 black students sat down at the lunch counter in Greensboro. Soon the sit-in had spread across the South, and a few months later, North Carolina native Ella Baker gathered with young people, black and white, at her alma mater, Shaw University, where they organized the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and launched a Southwide campaign for voter rights. Within 5 years, this grassroots insurgency delivered, in legal terms at least, a civil rights revolution in the form of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which outlawed Jim Crow segregation, and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which outlawed the literacy test and other barriers to free and fair elections. This was the backdrop for one of the most hotly contested and consequential elections in North Carolina's history. In 1960, leading contenders for the Democratic nomination had very different ideas about racial equality in North Carolina's future. Ive Beverly Lake, a respected professor of law and former assistant state attorney general, was a staunch segregationist who had advocated closing North Carolina's schools in order to resist desegregation. Terry Sanford, who had served as a paratrooper in World War II, represented a new generation who had seen the atrocities of German fascism as reflections of the American Jim Crow, and who returned home to break with the past. When Lake tried to bait Sanford on race issues, he answered by calling for a new day, built on better jobs, better education, better health for everyone. That appeal worked in 1960, and Sanford won the Democratic nomination and easily defeated his Republican opponent in the general election. In early 1963, to mark the 100th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation, Sanford delivered a remarkable speech at a gathering of the North Carolina Press Association in which he called for an end to the reign of Jim Crow. Liberating black North Carolinians from oppression, he argued, was a necessary first step toward liberating much of the state's white population from grinding poverty. Later that year, Sanford put these words into action by founding the North Carolina Fund, a one-of-a-kind, private, nonprofit agency dedicated to eradicating poverty in North Carolina by giving marginalized black and white citizens a voice in state politics. The fund sought not only to uplift the poor, but to organize them, to register them to vote, and mobilize them on election day. Here's Governor Sanford with President Lyndon Johnson in Rocky Mount, North Carolina, visiting a tenant white sharecropping family, and with an effort to try to make this war on poverty inclusive.
And I should jump in here to say that this image is in the slideshow at my insistence in part because I grew up in Rocky Mount. I was 8 years old at the time, and while most of my parents' friends, when they heard LBJ was coming to town, they put their kids indoors, dropped the blinds, and locked the doors. Mine put me out on the curb to meet the civil rights president. So, a personal connection to his story.
Now, conservative white Democrats, this is
about mobilizing them.
Oh, I thought we'd already done that. Yeah, so we've already done that. Okay, sorry. Conservative white Democrats resisted Sanford's agenda from the outset. In 1964, a sizable minority of them cast ballots for Barry Goldwater, the conservative Republican presidential nominee, who urged members of his party to, quote, rise up and turn against minority groups. The aim, he said, was to use the race issue to regain power for the Republican Party. In the years that follows, white voters in North Carolina heeded that call. In 1968 and again in 1972, they delivered the state to Republican presidential nominee Richard Nixon, who won the White House by pursuing what his advisors called a Southern strategy. That is, a political campaign built, they said, on the understanding of who hates whom. In 1972, white voters also elected Jesse Helms to the first of 6 consecutive terms in the U.S. Senate, where he became the leading voice of a conservative movement known as the New Right. At this point, Republicans might have easily gained control of state government, but from the mid-1970s through the mid-1980s, black North Carolinians won a series of lawsuits in which the federal courts took action to enforce the Voting Rights Act by striking down multi-member at-large elections in the state legislature as well as at local level, and by throwing out the anti-single-shot laws as violations of the right to cast a free and fair ballot. The consequences were startling. By 1989, 19 black law members served in the General Assembly. 2 years later, members elected Daniel Blue as Speaker of the House, until that time, the highest legislative office ever held by a black politician in North Carolina's history. Blacks also made substantial gains at the local level, where more than 400 black elected officials served in city and county governments across the state. From the early 1990s through the early 2000s, North Carolina politics settled into a wobbling equilibrium. Republicans carried the state in every presidential contest until Barack Obama's election in 2008. But at the state level, Democrats controlled the governor's office for 2 decades, from 1993 to 2013, and they wielded sufficient power in the legislature to press forward with a progressive agenda. In 1992 and 1996, Jim Hunt won his 3rd and 4th terms as governor with a promise to, quote, change North Carolina, to build a state that would be America's model. Working with Democratic lawmakers, Hunt established Smart Start, which poured millions into preschool education. He raised teacher salaries to the national average, and he launched Health Choice, a program for uninsured children. Hunt also committed to inclusive government. When he left office in 2001, 22% of his appointees in state agencies and commissions were minorities, a figure that matched North Carolina's demography. In the state legislature, Democrats sought to secure these achievements by expanding minority citizens' access to the ballot. Key legislation permitted early voting, allowed voters who went to the wrong precinct on election day to cast a provisional ballot, permitted same-day registration, and created a system to pre-register 16 and 17-year-olds so that they could have their names placed on the voter rolls when they turned 18. The net effect of these reforms was increased political participation by minority populations. Black registration grew by more than 50% between 2000 and 2012 as compared to just 16% among whites, and black turnout followed apace. Between 2000 and 2008, it soared from 42 to 72%. That level of participation was critically important in the 2008 presidential election, when Barack H. Obama won North Carolina with a margin of just 14,000 votes out of over 4 million ballots cast.
So in the euphoria of the moment, I'm sure we all remember many pundits held up Obama's election as evidence that America had entered a new era of post-racial politics. But again, as we all well know in hindsight, nothing could have been further from the truth. The election of a black president ignited a firestorm, a fearsome backlash. In 2010, white voters' rage, stoked by a wealthy, well-organized national network of political donors, fueled what came to be called the Tea Party revolt. Republican leaders embraced the fury and presented themselves as the party that would defy the black president and his supporters. I think this quotation from Ron Unz, who was the publisher of an online platform called the American Conservative, sort of summed up at least the way he saw the situation. And I think this is worth reading here just to make sure that you can see the words. Unz wrote that as whites become a smaller and smaller proportion of the local population in more and more regions, they will naturally become ripe for political polarization based on appeals to their interest as whites. And if Republicans focus their campaigning on racially charged issues such as immigration and affirmative action, they will promote this polarization, gradually transforming the two national political parties into crude proxies for direct racial interest, effectively becoming, he said, the white party and the non-white party. Embracing that reasoning, Republican leaders in North Carolina presented or began to introduce into local campaigns quite direct racial appeals. The two images we'll show you here are mailings sent out statewide by the Executive Committee of the Republican Party, appealing in this instance to sort of the age-old specter of the black rapist let loose on white women. Think back to that political cartoon from the News and Observer. And in this next flyer that went out in the mail, a claim that Hispanic voters, of course a growing portion of North Carolina's population by this point, claiming that they were somehow behind policies that amounted to, as this political flyer said, mucho taxo. On Election Day 2010, Republicans won majorities in both houses of the state legislature. They subsequently gerrymandered legislative districts to favor their interest, and in 2012 turned their advantage into a supermajority. And of course, in that same election, they also sent Republican Patrick McCrory to the governor's office. Now, months later, the U.S. Supreme Court gave North Carolina Republicans a gift. In a case called Shelby v. Holder, the Supreme Court struck down Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, which had safeguarded the rights of protected minorities by requiring federal pre-clearance, the term was, that is, federal pre-approval of changes to voting procedures in designated jurisdictions, mostly in the South, that had a demonstrable history of restricting opportunities for minorities to register and vote. And much, but not all, of North Carolina was covered by that provision. Literally within hours of the Shelby ruling, Republican lawmakers in North Carolina announced that they planned to introduce legislation that would fundamentally alter the ways that North Carolinians registered to vote and cast their ballots. What emerged was House Bill 589 in 2013, a law that would have made voting harder for Black and Hispanic citizens by shortening the early voting period, by eliminating same-day registration and out-of-precinct voting, and for the first time in North Carolina's history, imposing a voter photo ID requirement. Well, Republican lawmakers had the votes to brush off Democrats' objections to House Bill 589, to this overhaul of election law, but popular outrage wouldn't be so easily dismissed. And I think we all remember that throughout the summer of 2013, great crowds of protesters gathered outside the legislative building in Raleigh. They stood side by side to demand a new fusion politics, if you will. What Reverend William Barber, a Goldsboro pastor and president of the state conference of the NAACP, what he called a third Reconstruction, thinking back to those years immediately after slavery, the years of the Civil Rights Revolution, and now the challenge of the moment in 2013. In that same year, the NAACP, the League of Women Voters, and the U.S. Justice Department took House Bill 589 to court. Bob and I worked together on a brief in that case, and I testified in federal court as an expert witness on behalf of the plaintiffs. We lost the case in federal district court, but subsequently prevailed when the U.S. Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals ruled in 2016 that House Bill 589 targeted minority voters, the court said, with near surgical precision. The lead plaintiff in that case, NAACP versus McCrory, was this extraordinary woman, Rosanelle Eaton. She was the granddaughter of slaves. She had been a public school teacher, and she was a civil rights activist who had first registered to vote back in 1942 in that campaign of expanding the Black electorate that Bob described to you earlier. Well, in the wake of of House Bill 589 being thrown out by the Federal Court of Appeals, Republicans in the state legislature didn't concede defeat. Instead, they regrouped and they narrowed their focus to a voter photo ID requirement. In 2018, they won popular approval of an amendment to the state constitution to mandate that requirement, that every voter present a photo ID in order to cast a ballot. And in the closing days of the legislative session, while they still had a veto-proof majority, they passed Senate Bill 284 to implement that new constitutional provision. And Senate Bill 284 is, again, as I think you know, currently in court. It was recently thrown out in a state lawsuit. I testified in that case as well. But surely that judgment is going to be appealed all the way ultimately to the state Supreme Court. And Senate Bill 284 is also subject to federal review in a case that hasn't yet come to trial. And I'm scheduled to testify a third time when the law does go to trial. Now, critics have raised objections to Senate Bill 284 on several counts. They point out that the photo ID has been touted as a means of countering widespread voter fraud for which there is no substantial evidence. And that it's based on, as its proponents said, common sense notions that upon closer examination turn out to be not so sensical at all. Some of you may remember this flyer from that campaign in 2018 and the claim that voter photo ID was common sense. It was just like what was required of you to see an R-rated movie, board an airplane, and so on. The only problem here is no law says that a movie theater has to require a photo ID to admit you to an R-rated movie. It's actually the case that the TSA will let you board an airplane without a photo ID. It's a cumbersome process, but you can do it. It's not universally necessary to present a photo ID to cash a check, nor to use a credit card. In fact, if you look at the rules that MasterCard and Visa and American Express lay out for the use of their credit cards, they expressly prohibit the requirement of photo ID for anything other than a cash withdrawal with a credit card. Now, as a matter of law, the concern is that Senate Bill 284 will create two classes of voters, divided largely along racial lines. Critics point out that blacks are far more likely than whites to lack access to private and to public transportation that would enable them to obtain a photo ID. And they also note the potential for intimidation and discrimination at the polls. For example, if you don't have a photo ID, the law allows you to claim an exemption, a reasonable impediment. But election officials aren't required to inform voters of that opportunity. The voter has to know to ask for it. And of course, you're compelled to ask for it in a public setting where you risk some humiliation for making that request. If your request is granted, you wouldn't cast a regular ballot, you would cast only a provisional ballot, which election officials would decide later either to count or to reject. And then finally, there's, as I said, the concern over intimidation. Senate Bill 284, like House Bill 589 before it, would allow political party leaders to appoint poll watchers who would be in a position to challenge voters now at any polling place in the state. That's a big change from previous law that limited those challenges to the precincts in which the poll watchers themselves are registered. So where does that leave us today? Well, nearly half a century ago, Martin Luther King Jr. described a dream. A dream, he said, of equality of opportunity, of equality of privilege and property widely distributed. A dream of a land where men will not take necessities from the many to give luxuries to the few. A dream of a nation where all our gifts and resources are not held for ourselves alone, but as instruments of service for the rest of humanity. The dream of a country where every man will respect the dignity and the worth of human personality. Today, as in King's time, that dream remains at risk, as we argue in Fragile Democracy, and unfulfilled. Well, let us stop there, and thank you for your attention, and we welcome questions and really looking forward to the opportunity for conversation and discussion here.
Great, thank you both. I wanted to take a moment to introduce the students that are helping us out tonight, who are all working closely on some internships and some engagement opportunities with League of Women Voters. Paris Rogers is here. She is a junior in the Honors College with a major in social work and minors in political science and French. And then Molly Remillard is a senior majoring in communication studies with minors in women's and gender studies, as well as political science. And as someone that has supervised our internships from the faculty side for some time, I've seen some great internships and some internships that have just been okay. And I wanted to publicly state how great of a job that Marla and the League of Women Voters have done, particularly with this group of interns. She's very engaged with them, and it's really a great opportunity. So thank the students for being here tonight. And Paris, I think I'll turn it over to you. I know you said that you had a couple of questions ready from the audience.
Yes, thank you very much for the introduction. So for the first question, how have political parties and their beliefs changed over the years? What have you guys noticed?
Yeah, well, I think the simplest answer to that question is, I hope it was sort of visible in what we were saying, but we didn't call it out directly. And that is what you saw in the 20th century was a sort of dramatic realignment that really begins in the 1930s with Franklin Roosevelt and the New Deal, the increased Black political voice in the Democratic Party. So that by the 1960s, the Democratic Party has become not the party of white supremacy as it had been at the end of the 19th century, but now the party of civil rights. And the Republican Party was much less the party of Lincoln than a party, as we said in the presentation, increasingly defined by a kind of white racial sensibility.
Thank you very much. And another historical question. There are many parallels between what has happened historically to threaten democracy and what is currently happening today. What do you think is the greatest threat today, and what can we do to combat that threat?
Wow. Well, I think there are a lot of threats and issues out there. I think certainly one of the things that we are really focused on is this, access to the ballot box and voting rights. I mean, we've got laws like those that have been tried in North Carolina before state legislatures all over the country, trying to push back some of the changes that have allowed for broader political participation and, for greater democratization of the political process. I think that if those laws and those practices are allowed to stand, that's a major setback for what our democratic system is supposed to be about. Gerrymandering, which is an issue we're facing in North Carolina right now. The General Assembly is trying to draw new districts both for the state legislature and for the congressional seats. Whether that is whether the reapportionment is representative of the views of people in North Carolina. Will be interesting to see whether whether it really speaks to the needs and representation of all people. And again, those things are going on in multiple states. So I think that there's a chorus of people, and some in the Republican Party now, who are saying that this might be one of the greatest crises in American democracy probably since the Civil War. I think from my perspective, being able to look back and understand a couple of these issues that we opened with, understanding the cyclical nature of it, understanding how central kind of race has been to the divisions in the political process is really critical in understanding what's going on today.
I would just add to that after Shelby v. Holder, we're also in a very weakened position in terms of legal challenges to restrictions on the right to vote. people can make criticisms of the voter ID, for example. Does it make sense or not? Is there real fraud and so on? But those questions are not questions that a court of law is going to consider, right? And without Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, it is now much, much more difficult than it was in the past to contest the restrictions of the franchise in a court of law. I would just add on gerrymandering that, gerrymandering has a long history, and both parties have gerrymandered. I think you would argue we sort of live in a different historical moment, that the technologies we have now give us the power, to divide people racially and otherwise almost down the middle of a street in the same neighborhood. We can do it with that kind of precision. Personally, I know I speak for Bob as well, and for a growing number of people, again, across the two parties, who would make the argument that it's time to depoliticize that, and that democracy would be well served if we had some sort of nonpartisan process for drawing fair boundaries for districts of political representation.
And it's very interesting that you bring up the possibility of nonpartisan creating equal representation, because I just got a question here that says, what are the chances of having a nonpartisan commission appointed to the reapportion of congressional and state legislative seats?
Well, I think there's if we've seen just in North Carolina in the last few weeks, actually, there was a conference at the Sanford School at Duke, in which you had people, Republicans, Democrats, conservative, progressives, liberals, all sitting down at the same table and talking about the need for nonpartisan, allotment of seats, and saying that, that the functioning of our system of government was really dependent on moving in that direction. So I think that there's there's a lot of momentum, and I think a lot of, if you poll most people in the country, they're in favor of nonpartisan, redistricting. It's just, people who have political power at this particular time, are resistant to that.
And if you think about, kind of where gerrymandering has brought us, particularly given the kind of precision which can be done today. I mean, just think of the polarization of our politics and of events in January. I mean, it's not hyperbolic, right, to talk about a real and present danger and a threat to democracy, because our politics are so polarized, and we now kind of live in a political environment that encourages candidates, not to try to bring people back and forth across the line of division, but to separate them more sharply than ever.
And that also reminds me with what you guys are talking about, gerrymandering, and especially what you were saying about, you'll have certain areas where it's just split right down the middle of a street. I have to do a quick plug for the League of Women Voters. They have a great YouTube video about this, which was a talk they did. And this just reminds me of the same things, talking about integrating the community. And with integrating the community, how can we be proactive for voting rights? As you're saying, these are all congressional things, but how can the local person get involved?
Well, I mean, one of the most immediate things you can do, I think, if you believe that it's important for people to have an opportunity to cast a ballot, is to be involved on election day, or being involved before election day, and whatever your party affiliation is, in efforts to register people to vote and to help get people to a polling place so that they can cast a ballot.
I think another really important thing is to try to educate ourselves and educate other people about, about the political system in this country and its history, and what it's set up to do and what it's set up not to do. I mean, it's one of the things that bothers me about some of these, new laws or new regulations that are being passed about what you can teach in the schools is it takes all the tension and the contest out of American politics. If you can't talk about slavery and racism and discrimination and Jim Crow and segregation and disenfranchisement, if those are all buzzwords that are not allowed in the classroom, and all you can do is teach the words that come out of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence without any interpretation, any analysis, any engagement with that, you're creating, a citizenry that has no critical thinking in what is the most important dimension of our society. Our government, the way we govern ourselves, the way we distribute goods and resources and stuff. So, I think that the fight around voting rights and educating people around voting rights, working with groups like the League of Women Voters. I'll just say one other thing. When we started promoting our book last year, we sent out copies to a lot of different organizations that work on voting rights, and I was amazed at how many there were in North Carolina. Now maybe there are too many. We need to get a few more of them together, but there are dozens and dozens of places. Some are just working in one county or one city, or others are statewide. Others, like the League of Women Voters, are affiliated with national organizations. But there are plenty of places, plenty of ways to get engaged in these issues. You don't have to go very far from home to be able to do that.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I think that was a brilliant point about pointing out, just how many organizations are available and are at our fingertips and that we can get involved with. Another historical parallel question: what parallels or not do you see between the 1898 coup and the attack on the Capitol of January 6th?
Oh,
well. Interesting question.
I think in some ways the obvious answer is that there are lots of parallels. I know January the 6th, as I watched television, I couldn't help but think of Wilmington. Because part of the white supremacist campaign in 1890, was not just those racial appeals that you saw, say, in that cartoon in the News and Observer, but also claims of fraudulent elections, right? That biracial alliance had taken control of the legislature, the governor's office, and that at some fundamental level that had been a fraudulent victory. So, those claims of fraud and the sort of outright unmasked racial appeals, very clear parallels. I should just say, as a kind of little footnote, when we're talking about 1898, one of the things that makes North Carolina so interesting in Reconstruction and in the 1890s is that in Reconstruction, a larger percentage of whites went across the race line than in any other Southern state to forge a biracial alliance in the Republican Party. And in 1894 and 1896, this was the only state in which a fusion biracial alliance gained control of both the legislature and the governor's office. So, in the late 19th century, biracial politics had a chance anywhere in the South. One could argue that the best chance was in North Carolina. And I suppose the hopeful side of me today would make a similar kind of argument. If you think about our politics in the 20th century, right? North Carolina, has gone back and forth across the political spectrum, but always by the narrowest of margins. I remember when people used to say to me, how in the world can it be that Terry Sanford and Jesse Helms are in the U.S. Senate together? And I said, well, that's North Carolina, right? It's kind of the peril and the promise of North Carolina. politics, there is a kind of, I think, historically a potential here that perhaps isn't as close to hand elsewhere in the South.
I wonder, Paris, if I could ask you and maybe some of the other students a question. Like, what are the concerns that you have as you're young people, you're voters now? You know, you're going to inherit the country that our generation has messed up in all kinds of different ways. Well, you know, what are you thinking? What are the kind of questions you're asked? What are the things you're talking about in your classes and in your dorm rooms when you sit around having coffee? Are these a set of issues that have some urgency for young students these days? And maybe some of your fellow students can ask questions or say something in the chat, but you also might have something to say yourself.
Sure, I'm just gonna give everyone a moment to collect their thoughts.
Yeah.
And if you guys want, you can write me privately, or you can write just the chat in general and I'll read them out. The first thing that comes to my mind is misinformation. I just find that that's one of the biggest issues I am currently concerned with regarding voter information, and certainly what we've seen with the past presidency and the dissemination of information and just having to fact check everything and what's right, what's not right. Here's a trusted authority figure who's saying things that when you go to check the facts, it doesn't seem like they're lining up. And so that's one thing I'm definitely concerned about.
Yeah, our sources of information are so fractured and polarized. Politics was just as complicated in an earlier era, but at least this part of it was a little different when, you know, Bob and I think back to when we were your age, and if you had a really good antenna on the top of the house, you got all 3 national networks, right? Instead of 480 cable channels, each with a different. There was a way. Well, at least you were all arguing from the same text, as opposed to this great kind of variety of claims to truth and veracity.
And please correct me if I get your name wrong, but Heidi says she definitely believes, or sorry, I shouldn't assume gender. They definitely believe being in social work, there's a sense of urgency in this area, but I'm wondering, how do we approach these subjects with people who are convinced that their facts are right? It's a sensitive topic and can turn very quickly heated.
Yeah, I mean, I would just say there are a lot of people, particularly my friends who are social psychologists, who are much smarter about this than I am, and so I would probably defer to them. I think from my own experience, trying to argue someone immediately into the ground over a difference doesn't go very far. Usually doesn't go very far when somebody tries to do it with me either. I suppose. I mean, I'm just sort of thinking about this on the fly, but I suppose in some ways it's why we wrote this book and why we think history is so important, right? That going back and getting that perspective can be a way of getting a little distance and a little maybe more of a disinterested perspective on the kinds of issues that are, you know, at the center of our politics today. And to understand that in some ways there's not a lot new here, but.
I think the other thing is to find issues that you may agree a little bit more on. You know, if you look at polling in this country, it's like, you know, most people are supportive of women's right to abortion, women's right to choose. Okay, and yet we've got, you know, state legislatures and, you know, and political parties that are, you know, doing everything they can to challenge that. Actually, people, despite their political preference or who, you know, a candidate they support, there's actually a lot more agreement about a lot of really important issues in this country, you know, including the environment, you know, a major issue, and including gerrymandering and democracy, including a woman's right to choose, including a lot of different things. So, if you really dig deep into what people in this country believe, we've got a broad consensus on a lot of issues. But it's like it's all messed up and fogged up by the kind of political rhetoric and people arguing and fighting with each other, over personalities or name calling over things, as opposed to, digging down and seeing where we have agreement on issues. And I think particularly for young people, that's one way to do it.
Yeah, I think you could add to that list. We'll disagree on how to get to these goals. But I think, a majority of us believe that every child should have access to a quality education, right? That because you're poor, you shouldn't be denied health care. Living wage, access to affordable and decent housing. I mean, again, if you, as Bob said, if you look at polling, there's a lot of agreement, at least in broad terms, on those issues. What we have to do is, reconcile our differences about how we reach those objectives.
And with reconciling differences, and you brought up the sector of education, but someone else, Alexander, is also asking about the public health sector. Do you believe it is possible to clearly delineate between censorship and minimization of mis and disinformation?
Well, in terms of COVID and the kind of those kinds of issues, I don't know.
Sure. I mean, there is some great territory there, right? But we also live in a world of facts. COVID exists. COVID is contagious. COVID isn't the flu. Vaccines prevent COVID. And I do think we have to be insistent on arguing from fact. There are real facts in the world. And arguments that aren't grounded there should be called out. It doesn't seem to me that's censorship. It doesn't say you can't say them. But it is, I think, very important to confront them.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
thank
wow,
you very
what an
much.
interesting set of questions. I mean, just the whole debate over vaccines also opens up, a conversation about the very different ways in which, Americans think about freedom, and these differences are as old as the Republic. I mean, is your freedom the liberty to do anything you please, regardless of the consequences for others around you? Or is your freedom limited by responsibility? Or I'd put it differently. I mean, is your freedom defined by responsibility, right? It's only I'd argue that only in an environment in which we are responsible to one another that any of us can ultimately live free. But that's an argument as old as the Republic, and actually even older than that.
Well, and it's what one of the things that government's supposed to do. I mean, it's supposed to create a platform, an environment in which people can discuss and debate these kinds of tensions within our system. And I would say that one of the problems right now with the whole issue of public health is that we don't have a robust, engaged political system where people, have outlets for discussions about things that are really important for them, or they don't feel like they do. They don't feel like they have representation in Congress, or the president doesn't represent them, or something. I think there's a lot of frustration and even anger, among people in the population. And unfortunately, I think it's getting deflected often in the wrong ways. Whereas if we had a kind of a more, I would argue, a more functioning democratic system with lots of debate and lots of discussion, people would have forums for that. They would have places in their communities where they could talk about the tension between individual rights and the common good. I mean, that's what these people in the 19th century, that was a big argument. They were trying to say the role of government is look out for the general good, for the needs of everybody as opposed to the needs of one individual. And I think we're missing that in this country, and I think it's showing up in the debates about COVID and other public health issues today. Great question, though.
That just makes me think of like the salons and the old intellectual like cafes and meeting places where people just come and debate. But also speaking about what you were originally saying with freedom and responsibility, one of the people asks, voting used to be limited to only landowners. Now it is open and everyone has access to multiple opportunities to vote. So there should be a fair amount of responsibility for voting. A simple proof of identity should be considered as a bare minimum for a voter to cast a ballot to have accountability. Why is this such an issue?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that's a really good question. In fact, I was asked in court, well, would you be opposed to every form of voter photo ID? And my honest answer was, I don't know, because we've not had that conversation, right? What we got was the imposition of photo ID in a campaign based on appeals to non-facts about widespread voter fraud, and enacted not after deliberation, but within a matter of weeks before Republicans lost their supermajority and could be assured of overriding Governor Cooper's veto. Those are the circumstances in which we got this. And so that's where the concerns come from, because the evidence seems very clear that there is a racial differentiation, difference in the capacity to obtain an ID. There are lots of opportunities. You can go to the election office, Board of Election office and get a free one. You can go to the driver's license office, but you have to get there. But if you look at the statistics, Black North Carolinians are considerably more likely not to have access to private transportation and to public transportation, to not own a car. Why? Because if you look at the data, you see that they pay much higher rates of interest on auto loans, much higher rates of insurance. They're more likely to be impoverished than white North Carolinians. Many people live in parts of eastern North Carolina where there is no public transportation. So it's nice to say, well, you can have a free one, but you have to get there in order, right, to claim it. So maybe there is a way to have a photo ID requirement. I'd be open to that conversation, but I think what we have to do is step back and say, well, if we want to enforce that requirement, let's have a conversation about what has to be done, what government must do to make sure that regardless of your circumstances, there is no impediment, right, to getting a photo ID. Maybe we could get there, but as I say, we've not had that conversation, right? This whole drive has been really animated by partisan concern, far more, at least in my judgment, than a real meaningful concern to election security. That's a kind of, mask for sort of what's really at issue. And we should remember that, in North Carolina, Black North Carolinians suffer poverty at about twice the rate of whites. Why is that? That's the legacy of Jim Crow, right? this history that Bob and I have been talking about tonight, it's not just dead and dusty in the attic and in the past, but it's legacies, right? They live in the world with us today. So let's have a conversation about voter ID, right, that takes all that into account and tries to figure out how we could do this in an equitable way. Maybe we could get there, but we haven't tried that yet.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I think that's an important point, and also, like you said, tying it back to the present day and what's going on now. And these are current issues. Also, speaking about different forms of debate, Jeanette and Heidi were wondering what would be a healthy debate about the pros and cons of the Electoral College, and what are your general thoughts and opinions on the Electoral College?
Wow, these are such easy questions.
Been having good, it's taking some good political science questions. Well, I think the first thing is to go back and look at what the intent of the Electoral College was. What was it intended to do? Was it intended to advance kind of broad-based democracy, or was it put in place as a way of really restricting the vote and the voice of the large majority of people, even just the white men who were allowed to vote? So to start with, you have to historicize these institutions that we have. In the same way that you want to understand, well, why do we have the kind of political system that we have instead of a parliamentary system like the British have or the English have? Where do these institutions come from? Why do we have a Supreme Court where you're on the court for life as opposed to something where a different kind of structure? All of these things, all of these institutions that we have to live with now have a history, and they were determined, they were shaped, they were framed by the politics of their day and the way in which particular groups of people exercise power at the expense of other people. And I think the Electoral College is a good example of that, and it's a good example of the way in which large minorities, and in this case smaller states and rural populations, most of which are white, exercise a disproportionate amount of power in this country. So I think there are a lot of different ways that you need to approach that.
Yeah, I'm sure you've seen the maps and seen the commentary on them, right? The maps of the United States that do the county by county, sort of the way the elections go, and it's all red. Teeny little dots of blue, right? But what that misrepresents is that those places are sparsely populated. The state of Montana, do they have 1 million residents yet? Have as many senators as the state of New York. Is that a good thing, bad thing? What does that do for democracy? That's the Bob's point about historicizing, and it's worth remembering. There's a wonderful book, and there's been lots of debate and argument about it among historians and political scientists, but a wonderful book to kind of get started called Slavery's Constitution. And it looks at the multiple ways, without invoking the institution of slavery or even saying the word, the Constitution sets up a government that in that moment was designed in part to protect the interest of slaveholders in the South. The Three-Fifths Compromise is, is the counting, the Three-Fifths Clause counting slaves as 3/5 of a person for representation, even though obviously they can't vote. That's an example, but the Electoral College is informed by that sensibility and concern as well. So history is a place to start, I suppose, is what we're saying. A couple of historians would tell you that.
So you poli-sci people need to be, double majoring in history and poli-sci.
What you were first saying at the start of your answer, Bob, was you mentioned the Supreme Court in relation to the Electoral College. Marlene is wondering, is there any process whereby the Supreme Court might relitigate their ruling on Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act? For example, a lawsuit initiated by the Department of Justice, or would it just be easier to pass new legislation?
I think the likelihood of this court reversing Holder is probably as close to zero as you could get. Right, but then that's why there's such focus on legislation that would restore that federal oversight that had been embodied in Section 5. And you only have to look at just the dramatic transformation of Southern politics to understand how powerful that pre-clearance requirement was. If you think about what Southern politics looked like in 1960, compared to particularly what local governments look like across the region today.
And alongside that, and what you were discussing about equal representation and just representation with your example of Montana and New York, what are your thoughts on the possibility of the United States ever adopting a proportional representation to combat something like gerrymandering?
Well, true proportional representation. Well, that's all.
Probably not very likely. About as likely as the actually alternative I would make an argument for would be a change to a parliamentary system, as opposed to a winner-take-all system, particularly a winner-take-all system which is engineered in many circumstances to produce a situation in which a minority winner takes all.
Yeah.
Right, a non-representative minority.
Yeah, I think, but it's also interesting to look comparatively, at other political systems in the world and understand how those have changed and how they've modified themselves over time. Sometimes it happens in the midst of crisis or revolution, or other times it comes from the people themselves. There's issues of representation and equality and the management of the economy. I mean, I think there are a lot of different factors that go into play to create and sustain political systems. And just because those in the way that we've this society, this country has changed dramatically over the last couple hundred years. There's no reason to think that our political systems in some ways shouldn't have some flexibility or might have some flexibility. And there might be some. I mean, I think there's the situation right now could potentially cause some changes in some of the ways that things are done. The gerrymandering thing could be one where you hadn't, if you started having really nonpartisan redistricting, and that really called on the United States, that's a major change in the outcome of politics and the representation of marginal and minority groups.
So long as we don't slide into authoritarianism first. Before January 6th, I was always a little more guarded, and even though I worried about those, I think it's a real possibility. We tend to assume, I think, because we live in a country that has been so politically stable for so long, that no matter what happens, the system will right itself. That's a very dangerous supposition, I think. I think we live at one of those moments that may turn out to have been a kind of critical moment of decision. We've gone in one direction for a long time. There's really nothing to guarantee that we won't go in a very different direction in a short time.
Mm-hmm. And kind of going alongside with that, and also our previous discussion about social contracts and responsibility with freedom, Dave asks, would you agree with the statement that freedom and equality are sworn and everlasting enemies, and when one prevails, the other dies? It's a very
Well, that's
relaxing
got-
conversation.
That's got to be a quotation from somewhere. If not, was that Dave? Yeah, should copyright that.
I don't.
No, I mean, I guess it's what I was trying to get at earlier with the point about responsibility and democracy. I'm not sure you can have either one without the other.
But it also depends on what you mean by equality. I mean, what do you mean by both of the terms? What is freedom? What is equality? Those are, I mean, we could talk forever, about our definitions, our understanding of which either one of those terms. And I think that's valuable. I mean, I think that's what we ought to be. That's what our public schools ought to be doing. I mean, when I went to public school, I took civics, and it was, I learned, I didn't have debates about fundamental issues like this. That would have been a really interesting thing to talk about in the 9th or 10th grade. I did some of that when I got to college, and I think you have an opportunity to do that. But most people don't get to go to college to have these kind of discussions, and that's where I think that our educational system needs to step up, and why I'm so distraught over the direction that it's going in. We need more dialogue, more discussion. We need to be talking in our schools, with students and with outside people, with the teachers who are there, the educators. We need to be talking about these fundamental issues that are at the heart of the society that we live in. The worst thing that we could be doing is cutting off that kind of debate and discussion. I mean, ignorance is not a way to operate, a modern society, and lack of debate and discussion and kind of thoughtful dialogue is not either.
Yeah, I mean, let me come back to it and just kind of explain how I would think about that question in those terms. So equality. I mean, at least to my mind, one way I would think about that is the notion that each and every one of us is entitled to remunerative employment, to decent housing, to protection from economic destitution, to access to quality health care, to access to a quality education. Right? So that would be, I think, the way I would define equality. And I would argue that if we all have access to those things, then we all have a greater capacity to live free lives. That is, to be the determinants of our own fate. Right? How can you live in freedom if you've been not denied an education? What does it mean to call yourself free because you're sick and you can't afford health care? What is it to be free, to suffer economic destitution and have no protection from circumstances that would have you living under a bridge on the interstate? What does freedom mean in that kind of world? I mean, it just seems to me it is a totally vacuous and empty concept. So that's how I would think about the connection between the two, and what I mean when I say you really can't have one without the other.
Well, I'd also think, go back and, if you want to think about what freedom means, go back and listen to the people that we started off with here tonight, the men and women who who had their first taste of freedom, during and after the Civil War, and what was on their agenda, what did freedom mean to them? And it's a lot of the things that that Jim was just talking about, and it meant, it also meant something about looking out for each other and having some responsibility to one another, thinking about the common good. And that, that was, that, I think the words, the actions, speak really loudly there. And again,
A constitution that established, a government, as that constitution said, instituted for the good of the whole. Right? I mean, that notion that somehow if we aim to serve the good of the whole, we would in turn maximize the freedom of each and every one of us. What a great question. We can do a whole semester seminar on that question. Right?
Thank you very much. And I really appreciate what you guys are saying about education and the need for equal or equitable access for all to education. And I know UNCW, the league, we all appreciate you coming here tonight for us being able to hold these forums and have these educated discussions and debates.
Well, thank you. We really appreciate the opportunity. And what a wonderful job you did this night.
You're fabulous.
Great.
Oh, thank you.
Somebody should put you on the payroll.
Thank you. So some of the students are also wondering, what is your opinion on the two-party system currently?
Well, we're stuck with it, I'm afraid. I think that's the long and short of it, at least for the near future. I mean, I'm like Jim. I would in some ways some kind of a multi-party system where your politics and your political affiliation lined up more closely with with your beliefs.
And it forces compromise.
And and in which you had to compromise would be perhaps a more democratic and more fruitful way for the government and for the system to operate. But I don't the kind of money that's involved, the kind of issues that are at stake, I don't see any of that happening anytime soon.
So I suppose at the end of the day, it's back to a question you asked earlier, that the responsibility of making a difference really devolves to us. And that can be overwhelming. I mean, I can't change the American political system. Maybe you can. I hope so. But I do think we shouldn't despair, because there are many things that each and every one of us can do in our individual lives, and added up, that can make a difference. Won't transform things tomorrow, but we can make a difference in the content and the quality of political discourse in this country, and have really honest conversations about very difficult issues and deep disagreement, right? I mean, there is a way to do that is civil and respectful of one another.
And I think clearly one of the easiest and best ways to continue working on the local level, like you just stated, and getting integrated in the community and involved, is voting. And Gabby is wondering if you think proportional representation would actually increase voter efficacy.
I think I think to some extent that I think if people felt like their vote actually had a better chance, or the kind of work that they did of having some kind of impact, and in a system that was where proportionality was more equally distributed, I think people might feel like that. I think a lot of people. Part of the reason our system doesn't work is there are too many people that are, even if they vote, they're turned off by politics. They don't like the political structure. They don't like the way Congress works. They don't like the influence of money. They don't like the influence of corporations or special interest groups. I think to some extent that's intentional on the part of people who don't want to see a kind of really robust political system. Those people have been with us since the beginning of the country, and they're not going away either.
That connects back to the issue of gerrymandering. I mean, imagine yourself as a passionate Republican in a gerrymandered Democratic district, or a passionate Democrat in a gerrymandered Republican district. Would you file for candidacy? What would be the point? Right? What would be the point? I mean, the outcome is a foregone conclusion. So that is one place where structural reform, I do think, could make a fairly profound difference.
Thank you very much. And for the final question of the night, do you think we are in Civil Rights Movement 2.0? And if so, where do you think students and community can best advance civil rights?
2.0, I don't know what, I think we've had a lot of civil rights movements, and certainly, the events of the last few years have exposed a lot of inequities in our system, particularly in our criminal justice system. And that there has been a mobilization of people, not just in the political sphere, but in lots of other ways too, to try to change those systems, to try to create more equitable court systems, or whether it's issues about policing, and how do you deal with issues of poverty and kind of wealth inequality. I think that there are issues on the table now that I think in a way haven't been on the table as visibly as they were in the 1960s, for instance. So in that sense, I think there is a kind of revitalization of a lot of the debate and discussion and the mobilization. I even see it among young activists who are they're looking back at groups like SNCC that we remembered. I've been involved in a couple reunions like that with young people, but they're charting their own course. Yeah, you old folks. We like to hear what you did in Mississippi in 1963 or 1964, but
It's not Mississippi. It's not 1960.
Right. we've got some different ideas and different agendas and different way of doing things. We're respectful, and we want to learn from that history, but we're not tied to it. And I think that's the important thing, is that you got to learn where you've been before you kind of figure out where you're going, and that's again, it gets back to this whole question of historical education. Well, thank you all of you, for those were fabulous questions, and you did a great job as moderator. We really appreciate the opportunity to talk with you, and appreciate all the people at the university and the League of Women Voters for a really exciting night for us. This was a lot of fun.
And if you want to see more of those images from this story, we do have a book website. It's easy to find. It's just fragiledemocracy.com, and lots of images there.
Well, thank you to everyone, and to you, Jim and Bob, and hope to get up to Chapel Hill soon and see you both. And thank you, Dr. King and Paris. What a wonderful job you did. And thank you to the students. You had great questions. And just thank you, everyone who participated in this. And I think there's going to be a lot of discussion going on in various groups about this book and about everything we've talked about tonight. So thank you, everyone. And I guess we'll sign off. Dr. King, are we about done?
I just want to thank everyone again, and thank you to our great scholars tonight, and to League of Women Voters and Paris. And these are the type of conversations, and unfortunately, the people that need to have some of these deep conversations are not the people that are in this chat, right? And so, along with voting, I think it's something that all of us can do to have some of these discussions with our family and our friends, and try to lower the temperature in the room a little bit, and get into some of these issues. So League of Women Voters and other organizations are great at getting people involved. So thank you all.
Thanks, everybody. Have a good night.
Yeah. Good
Okay,
night.
good night. Good night.